The sounds you hear are the cries of foxes in a quiet suburb late at night. This is the start of Octoberpod. The events depicted in this podcast took place in Yorkshire from January through March 2017. At the request of the listener who submitted this story, certain details have been altered to protect her privacy.
My husband used to snore. It was quite shocking, actually, so I got into the habit of wearing earplugs to bed. I kept wearing them even after the divorce because I found that I couldn't sleep without them. By the way, we split up because of his gambling addiction, not because of his snoring. We had already sold our house to pay off some of his debt, which forced the pair of us to move houses when we split up. I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom semi-detached house that was a short walk from where I worked. Neighbourhood wasn't the best, but on my salary I could have done a lot worse. It was an older house, built out of flat river rocks in the 1950s, and quite solid, but drafty in places. It was initially one big house, but then, in 2005, developers gutted, remodelled and split it into 2. They basically put an interior wall right down the middle of the house to partition it into 2 halves. Each house had 2 upstairs bedrooms which shared a full bathroom, its own private entry, and an open concept kitchen, living, dining room on the main floor. All the cabinets were these cheap IKEA things that were shocking. House A had access to a detached storage shed in the back garden, and House B, my house, had exclusive access to the basement. There was a water heater down there and little else. I never went to the basement much. By the end of my story, you'll know why.
Moving Houses, a true story submitted by Jules, narrated by Emma, co-host of Spine Chillers and Serial Killers.
Like I said, I was in House B. House A was left unoccupied. The neighbourhood wasn't the best, but that's not because I had bad neighbours. It was due to an absence of neighbours. There were maybe a dozen homes on my street, and, apart from myself, only 3 of those homes had anybody in them. At night and early in the morning, whenever I left for work, it was eerily quiet. I saw more foxes in that neighbourhood than people, and they made the most revolting noises at night. Have you ever heard them? The cries of a fox sound exactly like a young girl screaming for her life. So unsettling. The first time I heard them, and remember, I was living on my own for the first time in 12 years, I called the police. They got out their torches and had a look about, and very politely concluded that either I'd mistaken the local wildlife for a crime in progress, or I was a nutter. A late-night Google search on the sounds foxes made helped calm my nerves. Of course, the local wildlife proved to be the least of my worries. I hadn't lived in the house for very long before I began noticing some peculiar things happening. At first they were trivial. For instance, there was a small toilet on the first floor, just a cupboard under the stairs really, with a tiny sink and loo, right around the corner from the door leading to the basement. One evening I came home from a miserable day at work, and guess what I found in the toilet? 12 or 13 rolls of toilet paper on the floor, all stacked up like a dainty little pyramid. I was knackered at the time and just made excuses for it, like maybe I'd stacked them like that before leaving the house and had just forgotten about it. But why on earth would I make a pyramid out of toilet paper? Remember how I said I slept with earplugs in? After moving into that house, I'd wake up and my earplugs would be gone. I'd always find them on my pillow or underneath me somewhere. Sometimes I'd find them placed neatly on the nightstand, as though I'd removed them in the middle of the night. Of course I had no memory of waking to take them out. That's not so weird, I told myself. People do lots of things in their sleep they don't remember. I tried switching to a different brand of earplugs, thinking perhaps I needed ones that fit better. But it made no difference. I'd reckon that while I lived there, my earplugs made it through the night only about 30% of the time. For that reason, I became more aware of the sounds inside the house at night. At about 2 one morning, a loud metallic crash in the kitchen startled me awake. I went downstairs to investigate. and found a saucepan had fallen from the pot rack. Now there's nothing weird about that. It was a cheap saucepan hanging on a cheap hook from a cheap pot rack. Things like that happen all the time, especially if you get all your home furnishings from IKEA. The odd thing was that when I picked the saucepan up from the floor, I saw that there were 2 earplugs inside it. At first I thought that the ones I'd been wearing that night had fallen out and gotten stuck in the folds of my nightie and fell into the pot when I picked it up. Except I'm fairly certain that I would have seen them falling in. What's more, when I went back to bed, I found another pair of earplugs, presumably the ones I'd slept with, standing upright on the nightstand. Looking back on it, it seems as though someone was sending a message. Someone was telling me, "I wanted you to hear this." I'm sure you're reading or listening to this and saying that you would have moved out by this point. And you're right, I probably should have moved house again. But these incidents occurred so far apart and each had a potentially rational, mundane explanation, or so I thought, that it never made a big impression on me. Though, in the retelling of these events, obvious patterns begin to emerge. Still, I was unsettled enough to invite my sister, Beth, to come for a visit for a week. She was keen to do it, as we hadn't really seen one another since my divorce, and also, she needed a change of scenery because she'd been having a rough go of it herself. Beth's presence seemed to put a damper on the weird occurrences in the house. However, there were a couple of odd things that happened. For starters, there was the television. We went out for drinks and a pub quiz the second night of my sister's visit. We came home, slightly pissed, to find the telly in the living room playing at full volume. There was no way we'd left the house in that state. I don't even think we'd switched it on at any point that day. We blamed it on a power surge or some setting we'd activated. Well, Beth did. I had my own suspicions. Strange thing was, the programme playing was a true crime documentary about a woman who'd been abducted. Beth was once in a toxic relationship with a total psychopath who, without going into too many details, abducted her at knife point and held her against her will when she tried to break up with him. They locked the guy up and Beth's fine now, but you never really get over something traumatic as that, do you? Seeing that documentary and the images on view were pretty graphic, including bloody crime scene photographs and CCTV footage of violent kidnappings, upset my sister a great deal. But we switched it off quickly enough and went to bed without giving it much thought. Later that night, about an hour or two before dawn, my earplugs had fallen out and I was awakened by a noise in the living room. I went down to investigate. It was a telly. It had switched on again. The same bloody documentary was playing. It was on the same scene that we'd walked in on when we first came home. I switched it to a different station and then switched it back, to see what channel it was that kept showing this documentary, but I couldn't find it anywhere. The station it should have been playing on was playing a rerun of Come Dine With Me, and I didn't have a smart TV or a Fire Stick back then, so it couldn't be blamed on a streaming service like Netflix or something. The rest of the week passed more or less uneventfully. The morning of Beth's last day, we were eating breakfast and I asked her if she'd had a restful visit. And she said, yeah, but I think you might have mice or squirrels in the walls because they've kept me up every night. Of course, the wall in the guest bedroom, the one her bed was against, was the wall separating my house from the empty house next door. I told her I reckoned she'd heard something in that other house. Maybe an animal had nested in there, like those foxes I was always hearing, and I'd have to call the landlord. I never did call though. Well, not until I rang them up to break my lease. When my sister packed up to drive to Leeds, I felt this dreadful black cloud descend on me as I realised I'd be alone again. Alone with it. But nothing happened. Not at first. In fact, a week or two passed without incident. Long enough for me to let my guard down. Long enough to forget. But that peace didn't last. This is what happened on my last night in that house. I had to be at work early the next morning, so I ate a gummy to help me sleep and went to bed around 9:30. Naturally, I wore my earplugs. Sometime later, maybe 1 a.m. or 1:30, I felt my earplugs working their way out of my ears. It felt like they were being slowly unscrewed, like I could feel them turning the way you'd loosen a screw with a screwdriver. I bolted up out of bed, swatting at my ears, and now that the plugs weren't in my ears, I could hear what was going on in the house. Somewhere downstairs, I could hear a fast, rhythmic banging sound, very loud. I also heard a faint metallic clattering. I was alarmed, but not necessarily frightened. I'd started the dishwasher before bed, and in my half-asleep state, I assumed the dishwasher was malfunctioning or something. But of course, it wasn't the dishwasher. I shuffled downstairs, and before I got to the kitchen, I saw that every light in the kitchen had been switched on. The overhead light, the lights inside the oven and the microwave, even the light on my electric kettle. There was a light on the extractor fan over my cooker top that was flickering on and off like a strobe light. It was pretty eerie. The thing making the noises I'd heard was 2 silverware drawers. They were banging open and shut, whacking against the counter so hard that I was afraid they'd break. The movement was so violent that forks and spoons and butter knives were spilling out onto the floor, which explained the metal clattering I'd heard. Of course there was no one in the house but me, no one who could manipulate the drawers, and no gadget or mechanism that would explain the movement. And they weren't moving randomly, they were moving in concert to a synchronized rhythm, like a heartbeat. Well, I could certainly take the hint. There was no way in hell I was sleeping in that house one more night. My jacket was slung on the back of a chair. I scrambled to put it on and then ran to grab my car keys from the hook next to the front door. The instant my fingers touched my keys, 2 things happened. First, the drawers stopped moving. They just froze in place. And all the lights in the kitchen switched off, except for the one strobing over the cooker top. Secondly, the deadbolt on the front door locked itself, and every doorknob in the house, from the door to the downstairs loo to the basement door, even the doors to the 2 bedrooms upstairs, began twisting on their own, all synchronized in that same heartbeat rhythm. I unlatched the deadbolt, the one that had engaged all by itself, and rushed out of the house. I got in my car and drove to a well-lit car park and slept in my car until dawn. That was on Friday, the 3rd of March 2017. I called in sick at work and stayed at a hotel all weekend. On Saturday, I called one of my mates to come with me, in broad daylight, to help me gather some of my clothes and essentials. I remember I had spent a lot of time thinking of some bullshit reason to give her, to explain why I'd left with only the clothes on my back. But before I had a chance to explain, she said, "Your house is haunted, isn't it?" This time the house behaved, long enough to pack up enough of my belongings to get me through a week or 2 crashing on the couches and blow-up mattresses of sceptical friends and relatives in the area. During that time, I informed my landlord of my intention to break the lease. The landlord didn't seem at all surprised. He didn't ask any questions and even waived the penalty that I dreaded paying. Beth came back to help me pack up the remainder of my things and place them in storage until I found a more permanent living situation. We didn't have the luxury of sunshine the day we did all that work. Clouds gathered at dawn, and then it started pissing it down, for hours on end. We worked quickly, chucked plenty of stuff in the bin, and didn't care that we got soaking wet. We worked all day, never stopping to wonder if anything's weird going on in the house. We just kept our heads down, trying to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. We had everything packed up. Beth started up the moving van while I went inside to do one last check to ensure the doors were locked, lights were off, windows were closed, toilets flushed, etc, etc. As soon as I'd got back inside, I noticed articles of clothing, my clothes I thought I'd already packed into the van, scattered all over the floor. At first it looked like they'd been strewn about willy-nilly, but as I went through the house picking them up, it seemed more like a trail of breadcrumbs, a trail leading to the basement door. I now know that I should have turned around and just left my clothes there on the floor, but I suppose I was still too focused on getting the job done to think it through. As I got closer and closer to the basement door, I could feel a strange sensation like pins and needles on my skin, and a weird metallic taste like an old penny in my mouth. I remember twisting the doorknob and then... nothing. The next thing I know, I'm lying in a hospital bed, being treated for a broken wrist and mild concussion. I asked Beth what had happened to me. She said that she'd found me face down on the steps leading down to the basement. I'd slipped on the stairs, bumped my head, and broke my wrist. Beth also said I was muttering some strange things. Strange? I asked, like what? She said I kept muttering. She's screaming for her life. He's holding her down. She is screaming.
It's intermission time, folks. I'm your host, Mr. Edward October. Since the dawn of cinema, when the projected images of an approaching train sent audiences running in panic, motion pictures have cultivated the art of making you jump out of your seat. Today we call them jump scares, and when it comes to a perfectly executed jump scare, there's no better place to find one than in a good horror picture. And so, between the acts of Octoberpod, I thought we'd all get a kick out of a rundown of a few of my favorite jump scares from the masterworks of horror cinema. But I won't be talking about the shower scene in Psycho, for example, nor will I mention Jason popping up out of the lake in Friday the 13th, or the shark popping out at Roy Scheider as he's shoveling chum in Jaws, or the hand coming out of the grave at the end of Carrie, as well as other similar De Palma dream scares. I also won't be discussing Val Lewton's bus from the Central Park stalking scene in Cat People, a gag which may just be the first example of the modern jump scare. I'm omitting these because everyone has seen them, and I will have nothing more to add to the discussion. Psycho's shower scene has its own documentary dedicated to it, for Christ's sakes. Since jump scares rely on the element of surprise, I must warn you I'm going to spoil the hell out of each one. If you don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast after I announce the title of each picture and come right back here after you've watched it. Right. Is everybody ready? Let's begin with Mulholland Drive and The Conjuring 2. David Lynch's Mulholland Drive isn't quite a horror picture. It kind of defies categorization. But make no mistake, there are potent scenes of horror in it, and it boasts one of the best jump scares in the history of cinema. Here's the setup. Two men seated in a diner have a conversation during which one of them, a very nervous man, recounts a terrifying, recurring dream about a grotesque man lurking behind that same diner. The two men leave to prove there's no scary man back there. As the two men walk out to investigate, the camera lingers on very specific visual details, as if to confirm that every aspect of the horrible dream is coming true. They approach the dumpster behind the building, and then... Notably, the jump scare affects not only the audience, but the characters themselves, because the man who had dreamed all of this dies of fright at the very moment Lynch springs the gag. The effectiveness of this jump scare relies almost entirely on the setup, wherein Lynch builds an agonizing, slow burn of tension and dread. The man behind the diner, incidentally, is played by Bonnie Aarons, an actress who is now best known as the Nun. The Nun is the iconic manifestation of the demon Valak, or is it Valak, from the Conjuring universe, a series of films and spin-offs very, very loosely based upon the shenanigans of problematic real-life paranormal investigators / Christian fundamentalist alleged con artists Ed and Lorraine Warren. The nun first appears in The Conjuring 2, and she is responsible for one of the best gags in a film full of gags, both clever and cheap. The gag and its setup is too complicated to summarize here, but it's the one where Lorraine walks into a room with a painting of the nun demon on the wall. When all of a sudden... There's a lot going on with this one, but I think it works thanks to subtle foreshadowing and lots of misdirects. The sequence begins with Lorraine seated in front of a bookcase, on which wooden blocks of the letters VALAK are displayed. The misdirects that follow: is that the demon looking over her shoulder? No, it's a painting. Is that loud noise the scare? Nope, just loud music on a tape player. Are essential because the audience knows a scare is coming, and the film knows that we know. The camera is constantly moving, tracking, panning, zooming in and out, in subtle and not so subtle ways, daring the viewer to scan the frame to predict when and where the gag will spring. The Exorcist 3. This picture was given short shrift upon its initial release, but it has since grown a rabid cult of followers. I am one such cultist. Aside from a very literate, philosophical approach by author-director William Peter Blatty, and performances par excellence from Brad Dourif, George C. Scott, and Ed Flanders, this downbeat sequel boasts what I contend may be the best jump scare in the history of horror cinema. Like Conjuring 2, this one also depends upon clever misdirects. The gag and setup here are more straightforward. A nurse is going about her rounds in a hospital on a rainy night. There's a false alarm mini-jump about halfway through, but unlike the nun jump scare, which is full of cuts and camera movements, here there are long stretches with the camera locked in place at the end of a long hallway, passively viewing the comings and goings from quite a distance away, almost like a God's eye view. There's no musical score, only the natural ambient sounds of a hospital at night. The audience feels detached and begins scanning the static frame to find the action or detail we're supposed to notice. In short, to find meaning in what we're looking at. This is a technique that Michael Haneke uses to maddening effect in his film Caché. The audience isn't quite expecting a scare, but also don't quite know what we're supposed to be looking at inside this. Tenebrae. While Suspiria is one of the most influential horror pictures ever made, especially visually, Tenebrae is, for my money, Dario Argento's best film, certainly in regard to execution of its premise. The jump scare is notable for being highly influential to the point that Brian De Palma straight up rips it off in the final shot of Raising Cain. This gag is also straightforward. Policeman walks in on a bloody crime scene. The camera is focused on him in a close head and shoulders shot when he bends down to reveal the killer standing behind him. But how can this be, since we just watched that character slit his own throat? Listen to what Maitland McDonough says about this sequence in her book, Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds, The Dark Dreams of Dario Argento. If you're a film nerd or a horror nerd, you need a copy of this book on your shelf. The policeman kneels down to pick up something from the floor. As he sinks gracefully out of frame, the killer is revealed standing directly behind him. The effect is that of a layer of skin being peeled off to reveal the new skin underneath. It makes the thematic suggestion that beneath the surface of every superficially bourgeois heterosexual capitalist can lurk the soul of a psychopath. This series of substitutions and equivalences establishes Tenebrae as a formal puzzle, a work whose logic is centripetal and supremely self-contained. The trick razor, used in the killer's staged suicide, is just another of Tenebrae's very own deadly, elegant illusions. This gag is just one of a dozen endlessly fascinating components of this nuanced puzzle box of a film, masquerading as the goriest TV police procedural you'll ever see, full of secrets and richly rewarding. If your knowledge of Italian horror cinema begins and ends with Suspiria, you owe it to yourself to seek this one out. Count Yorga and Blackula. In the early 1970s, American International Pictures debuted two new vampires who each starred in two films. Those vampires were Count Yorga, played by Robert Quarry in Count Yorga Vampire and The Return of Count Yorga, and Prince Mamuwalde, a.k.a. Blackula, played by the great William Marshall in the films Blackula and Scream, Blackula, Scream. Yorga is a smarmy Dracula clone, an Eastern European nobleman seeking new blood in modern-day Los Angeles. Blackula is an African prince, made into a vampire by Count Dracula himself and resurrected centuries later in modern-day Los Angeles. Aside from being vampires and aside from sharing a director, Bob Keljan directed both Yorga pictures as well as Scream, Blackula, Scream. Both characters apparently arrived in America on the same ship. AIP reused footage of Yorga's coffin being unloaded from a ship onto a truck in the scene where Blackula's coffin is also unloaded from a ship onto a truck. Count Yorga has a pretty cool fright gag that fucked me up when I saw it as a kid. A swinging young couple is stranded in their mystery machine-like van just outside Count Yorga's California estate. The wheels are stuck in mud and there's a storm brewing. So they decide to Netflix and chill in the back of the van until morning. They're awakened in the night by some noises. The girl opens the curtain on the back window and... It's fucking Count Yorga! Blackula also has a couple of good scare gags in that bad cape of his. One of them involves a vampire thawing out in the morgue. Another takes place in a dark room. Nightclub photographer Nancy walks into her apartment, puts on some soothing 70s soul music, and begins developing pictures in her ensuite darkroom. Did she hear a noise out in the living room? Why didn't the strange dude in the cape appear in the photo she just... Holy shit, it's Blackula coming like a bat on roller skates! This gag works thanks to contrasts and counterpoints. The soothing music coming from the brightly lit, pale blue living room plays against the mystery and intrigue of the developing photographs. The darkroom bathed in blood-red light. The vampire on roller skates effect is something of a signature finishing move used by both Blackula and Count Yorga. House on Haunted Hill and The Tingler. Speaking of roller skates, one of the most iconic jump scares involves a similar move courtesy of a hag in the wine cellar. Pilot Lance Schroeder and skittish ingenue Nora Manning are investigating strange goings-on in the wine cellar. They're knocking on the walls, listening for hollow spaces which might indicate a hidden room, and then... This is easily the cheapest and silliest gag on the list, but it's a lot of fun, like something out of a carnival dark ride. The film's director, William Castle, loved a gimmick, and was perhaps the only filmmaker in history who tried to produce jump scares both on screen and inside the theater. Take House on Haunted Hill. It was released with a gimmick called Emergo. There's a point in the movie when, spoilers, a skeleton rises up from a vat of acid. At that moment, a fake skeleton was supposed to fly into the audience, suspended on an overhead wire. A real-life jump scare. But Castle does one better in The Tingler. That picture is about a lobster-like creature that attaches to your spine. The only way to subdue it is to scream. For select screenings of The Tingler, Castle had a few seats rigged with electric joy buzzers, probably not unlike the personal massagers of today. There's a scene near the end of the movie that takes place inside a fictional movie theater. The buzzers were supposed to start going off when this happens.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives! The Tingler is loose in this theater, and if you don't scream, it may kill you. Scream! Scream! Keep screaming! Scream for your lives! It's here! It's over here! Help! 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 Look out, it's under the seat! Ladies and gentlemen, it's under the seat! The Tingler has been paralyzed by your screaming. There is no more danger. We will now resume the showing.
And I don't think we can do much better than that, do you? Are there any great jump scares that I missed? Leave a comment, along with a 5-star or equivalent rating, and educate me. Or chat with me about it on Blue Sky or Twitter. I'm at Octoberpod VHS on Twitter and at octoberpod.bsky.social on Blue Sky. Looks like intermission time is over, but the refreshment stand will remain open while we present this, our final spook story before the sun rises. Stay spooky, mes amis.
I've been an ordained minister for 8 years, and I am able to officiate weddings. In fact, I got ordained simply so that I could perform the wedding of 2 of my dearest friends as their high priestess. So, last September, I headed down to Florida to perform a Friday the 13th wedding and share in a momentous, blessed occasion of these friends who are like family to me. As magical peoples, we tend to form our tribes based on vibes. We may not all share the same interests, we may not all practice the same magical path, may not be drawn to the same things, but we do feel each other on an emotional level if we are willing to so deeply share our lives together. So, even though I may be vibrant color and full of art and light, and the groom may be a down-home southern gent, the bride is a dark jewel, all reds and blacks and purples, who enjoys collecting haunted objects, such as dolls. One of these dolls is named Annabelle, because of course she's named Annabelle.
A Night with Annabelle, a true account of her own personal paranormal encounter, submitted by Octoberpod co-producer and Witches Talking Tarot co-host Amber Jourdan. Narrated by Ari Shey.
She's about 18 inches while sitting, with open sockets where her eyes should be, and charcoal gray skin. Aside from being unsettling, at the time, she was situated right behind the bride's spot on the couch. So she was right in one's peripheral vision if seated on the couch, watching just over your shoulder with her dark gaze. The first night I was in town was the evening before the wedding, so I stayed with the bride in her bridal suite. This afforded us a chance to visit and go over any last details I needed to know prior to the wedding. The second night I was in town was the wedding night. So, of course, the bride and groom stayed in their honeymoon suite, and I spent the night in their home with the groom's drag son and their partner. Everyone had finally filed out and off to their own homes. The bride and groom had ridden off into the sunset on their trusty white four-wheel drive. I was rained after the wedding, so I was happy to crash on the couch while the other two house guests were in the bride and groom's bedroom. I began my nighttime routine. Getting some water within arm's reach, setting up my phone charger, making a safe place for my glasses, etc., etc., etc. Then I began setting up the couch for my sleep with a sheet and blanket, moving the cushions around so I could lie down comfortably. The couch we speak of was one of those oversized, once-in-a-lifetime overstuffed, and very deep-seated furnishings that had seen many years, and likely many rear ends. While I rearranged cushions to make a palatable sleeping surface, I locked eyes with Annabelle's eye holes. A shock ran through me as I realized she would be watching over me with those black, empty sockets as I lay sleeping. On the night of Friday the 13th, no less. I continued getting my sleeping pallets set up on the couch and tried to push the uncomfortable thoughts of Annabelle from my mind. "Okay, Annabelle," I muttered. "Let's be cool with each other. You don't mess with me. I don't mess with you. Just be cool." I said all this, knowing full well she had heard and understood me. It may sound crazy to those who don't believe, but trust me, this doll was fully aware. I began playing some comforting cartoons on Hulu and then changed into my jammies. Aiming for normalcy, I got into bed on the couch and settled back, my eyes glued to American Dad, my body weary from being a long day, and my head heavy. Sinking into the cushions, I relaxed even more and started to doze off. Within moments, my eyes shot wide open as the couch shimmied underneath me. I lay there for a few seconds in shock, trying to rationalize what I just felt. I tried to convince myself I just experienced a feeling when you doze off. The feeling of falling abruptly from a height and waking up. That's all. That was the only explanation that made any sense. Couches don't just move underneath you, unless you're like a character on the Addams Family or something, right? Still convincing myself nothing happened, I lay back on the cushions again and began to sink in. I refocused my mind on the cartoons and tried to get sleepy. Once my heart resumed its normal pace, I allowed myself to relax and my eyelids to grow heavy. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. I couldn't have been out for more than a minute when underneath my body, the couch undulated like a wave. Starting at my head and working down the entire length of my body, the cushions rose up, dipped down, rose up, dipped down, and rose up again. It was literally doing the wave. I shot straight up, completely shocked. There was no rationalizing this away like I tried to with a shimmy. I clearly felt the couch undulate beneath me. I could not believe it, and yet there was nothing else to believe. Quite terrified, I looked up and addressed Annabelle, asking her why she was messing with me, and could she please just leave me alone so I could get to sleep for the night? I requested a truce of Annabelle. Just let me sleep here for 2 or 3 nights, and then I would be out of her space. I fixed my eyes on the television and laid down again. I had to try really hard to relax this time. My heartbeat would not slow down for several minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I finally relaxed, bit by bit, watching cartoons and sipping a drink to calm my nerves. I nodded off for the third time that evening. It couldn't have been long that I slept. Forcefully under me, the couch yet again undulated, doing the wave. It rippled underneath me from head to toe, and I jumped off the couch. That was it. I couldn't take it. I grabbed my pillow and blanket and moved across the room. I tried with all my might to get comfortable, but it was of no avail. Annabelle's empty eye sockets stared at me. From under the shirt I threw over her face even. So I spent that night and the following night on a 6-year-old's top bunk. Without Annabelle gazing over my shoulder and making my bed shake, rattle, and roll, I slept quite well. Eventually. At that time, I was not in the habit of being open to something referred to as a haunted object. Even though I have experience working with the spirits, I allowed the appearance of the haunted doll to freak me out, which created a barrier between us. Annabelle viewed this barrier as a challenge, as a sign of hostility. And she certainly did react to it. So let this be a lesson to us all. Spirits are more afraid of us than we are of them.
Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers, outtakes, and bonus content as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producers are M.J. McAdams and Amber Jourdan. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip and various other stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitezi. All other images, music, and FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Follow us on YouTube at Octoberpod Home Video, on Instagram, and the app I still call Twitter at Octoberpod VHS, and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find us and all of our links on the World Wide Web at Octoberpodvhs.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this program, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And while you're at it, write us a 5-star or equivalent review wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
Hi there. Are you looking for a new D&D podcast? Why not check out Dice Company? We've got high stakes.
Inside that small, adorable chinchilla lies an enormity of demonic magic.
Drama.
Vander! Automaton, save the ship!
Comedy.
Alright, gents. I'm working on a poem. Do you want to hear it? It's called Sadness.
And a sentient automaton.
I find this to be acceptable.
Come escape with us. Dice Company. Wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Brew Crime, a true crime and beer podcast.
This is a podcast where we pick a theme, cover a few cases, and pair them with craft beer.
Join me, Mike.
And me, JT.
As we explore the world of crime, conspiracies, or whatever catches our attention. You can find us on social media at BrewCrime or our website, brewcrime.com. And you can find us on any podcast app at BrewCrime Podcast.
Join us as we discuss the horrible crimes that surround us and maybe Probably. Nah, definitely tip a bottle or two back as you do it. Drink with us the second and last Tuesday of every month.
Yo, it's your boy Shitey from award-losing podcast Dungeons and Dickheads. Do you like unhinged, wholesome shenanigans performed by 4 people you've never heard of who have no idea how to D or D? Then we're the podcast for you. Search for Dungeons and Dickheads in your local podcast provider of choice. We're the purple one. Someone stole our name. Or, even better, go to dungeonsanddickheads.co.uk. That's dungeonsanddickheads.co.uk for all the episodes and some extras. Dungeons and Dickheads is the comedy podcast for people who don't D&D good and want to hear people D&D worse than them with so little budget they can't make a proper advert, but we're having fun anyway.
Let's do that again. AIP, aka Blackula, played by the great William Marshall in the films Blackula. Ooh, I have Blaukla in the films Blauka and Scream Blauka, Blauka, Blauka. AKA Blackula. Motherfucker. If you're a film nerd, Bob Keljan directed both. I knew I'd do that. From the Conjuring universe. A series of films and spin-offs, very loose. Fuck it. 2 men seated at a diner. Nope. 2 men seated in a diner.
At first they were trivial. At first they were trivial.
If you don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast after I announce the title of each picture. Misspelled announce. Fuck me. Blackula also has a couple of good scare gags in that. Okay, that's that for that one. And then... Ooh, knuckle crack. Crazy crack. Crack house up in here. Don't quite know what we're supposed to be looking at inside this shot of a hospital, but up. And I interrupt myself with a fright noise. This is a technique that Michael Haneke got it right. Courtesy of a hag in the wine cellar of the titular house. Fuck it. Courtesy of a hag in the wine cellar. The misdirects that allow... What? Oh. The misdirects that follows... Nope. I think that about covers it. And is there anything else for me? Nope, that's the end. That's all I have. Good night and good luck.